In recent days, Sayadaw has been talking about the 4 kinds of satipatthana, and he's talked about the first 3 kinds as much as suitable. And there's one left, the last one, which is Dhammanupassana satipatthana. And today he will summarize that, but he won't speak at length about it. Although he won't speak at length about it now, he has described, through the course of the retreat, he's described how to note various objects. For example, when we're sitting and seeing, hearing, and smelling, and so on arise. He's described how to observe these. And when he described how the physicalities, when they arise, when we observe them, this is Kayanupassana satipatthana. When a feeling arises and we observe that, that's Vedananupassana satipatthana. When various forms of mind, such as thinking and planning and so on, arise, and we observe these, this is Chittanupassana satipatthana. And the last, when various forms of objects arise, this is called Dhammanupassana satipatthana. Well, because there are 4 kinds of objects that we observe, kaya, or physicality, vedana, feeling, chitta, the mind, and dhamma, various objects, there are 4 forms of satipatthana, 4 forms of anupassana. And among these, the first one, Kayanupassana satipatthana, the kaya is just rupa. We're simply observing rupa with Kayanupassana. And the second, vedana, feeling. Well, it's the mind that experiences the object, that feels the object. So this second anupassana is mental. And the third, chitta, the mind, this is also mental. And the fourth, Dhamma, is both physical, contains both physical and mental elements. So therefore we call it various objects. And today Sayadaw will explain how when various objects arise, when we note them as they arise, how Dhammanupassana satipatthana occurs. Okay. In this part, Dhammanupassana satipatthana, there's a complete variety of objects. When we practice, there are qualities called nivaranas that block kusala dhammas, block wholesomeness from arising. For example, the first one is wanting to hear, see, taste, touch, and smell good things. And sometimes anger arises, hatred, and the mind becomes rotten. This is dosa. Dosa is the quality which makes the mind rotten. And it's also called vyabhara nivarana. Sometimes the mind retracts. It's lazy and doesn't want to practice. It becomes gelid, solid, and unworkable. And this is called tina meda nivarana, the obstacle of sloth and torpor. And sometimes there's no control of mindfulness on the object, and what happens first is the mind leaves the object. It becomes separated from the object. That's called udicca, restlessness, and the mind runs here and there. And sometimes one recalls something that one has done that's unwholesome or that one's failed to do which would have been good to do, and regret arises. And that's the obstacle of kokocha nivarana. And sometimes, due to ignorance, doubt arises. Sometimes doubt arises regarding the triple gem. Sometimes regarding the practice, will it really bring benefit? Things like that. Is there really such a thing as karma? So this type of wavering, inability to decide about the object is vicikicca. And these are dhammas. These are various things. They're dhammas. They're sabhavas, true natures. So they're included in this category. And sometimes there's physical things that arise, sometimes feeling, sometimes anger, sometimes knowing. So all the 5 khandhas, the 5 aggregates, can arise in our experience. Sometimes what arises, as we see as the base, the striker, and the spark meeting. Physicality and mentality coming together on their own accord. And this is the truth of suffering, dukkha sacca. There's also samudaya sacca, the truth of its cause. And there's the forerunner path that we develop as we practice. If we develop this, then the kilesas die down. So all these things are dhammas. And when they arise, when we know it with the method of satipatthana, we see these dhammas, these natural phenomena, as they really are. We come to see rupa and nama. We come to see cause and effect. And we come to see, this is Dhammanupassana Satipatthana. Simpia, te viro o microphone, Simpia. Ian. There are 4 foundations of mindfulness. However, in summary, there's just one type, and that's called bhuta. Rupa is also bhuta, and nama is also bhuta. These occur due to causes. And kama chanda nivarana, the obstacle of kama, sense desire, it also arises due to causes. When we can't keep our mind on the object, then our mind goes to sense pleasures, which is natural because we live in a world of the senses. So that happens. And sometimes we crave a likable object when we meet one. Sometimes we meet with an unsatisfactory object and anger occurs, or hatred, or depression. That also happens, and it comes about due to causes. Sometimes laziness arises, we lose all our energy, we don't want to do anything. And this is tina mida, sloth and torpor. And this is also just natural phenomenon that occurs due to causes. And same with regret and remorse. These things are just a phenomenon that occur due to causes, and therefore they're called bhuta. The nivaranas, the obstacles, are called bhuta. And the 5 khandhas, the 5 aggregates, are also called bhuta. The base, the striker element, and the spark, these are also called bhuta. The truth of suffering and the truth of its cause, dukkha sacca and samudaya sacca, are also called bhuta. These all are bhuta. these things don't arise just out of nothing. And they're not created by a creator being. And there's no self in them. There's no inherent self in them. It said, Bhutani Kanda Panchakam. And these Bhuta are the five khandas, and because they occur due to causes, they come into being due to causes, so they're called Bhuta. They're born of causes. So they're called Bhuta. And also, we can experience them directly for ourselves. They're not imaginary, they're really there. And for that reason also they're called Bhuta. They arise due to causes, and they are knowable by our very being, by our very senses. So the objects of Satipatthana are four, but they are all one in terms of just this quality of Bhuta. What to do when these things that arise due to causes arise? It said, Bhutang Bhutato Pasati. So we have to know these things as they are. Bhutato means as they really are, as they occur. One should observe them as they occur. Observe rising as rising, falling as falling, hardness as hardness, softness as softness, flowing as flowing, solid as solid, hot as hot, cold as cold, tension as tension, stiffness as stiffness. And this is Bhuta, Bhutato Pasati. This is knowing what exists as it is, as it exists. And observing Kamasanda Nivarana, the obstacle of sense pleasure, as Kamasanda. Observing anger as anger, laziness as laziness, regret as regret, doubt as doubt, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, and so on. Just observing them as they are, Bhutang Bhutato. And that's also said, Yatha Sabhavato, according to their nature, Salekanato. That means seeing the nature of the object. So as they are, observing their characteristic. One comes to know the nature of physicality, the nature of mentality, the nature of cause and effect. And if one continues to note, one comes to observe their aspects, the aspects of conditioned phenomenon. They arise and then pass away. They're impermanent. And because of this impermanence, they're unsatisfactory, and they lack an inherent self. So one knows the phenomenon as they are. Yatha sabhavato salekanato. That means according to their natural characteristic. So one comes to know the individual characteristics of phenomenon, and also their common characteristics. And it's said that at this point the path of Vipassana is open. So if we look well at something, then our seeing will also be good. So what we see depends on our looking, how we look. So Bhutang Bhutato Pasati says how we should look. So Bhutang Bhutato is a summary of the entire Satipatthana Sutta in just 3 words. That is, to see what exists as it is. So, for people who like to know the essence of something, this is a good thing to remember. It's just these 3 words. Bhutang Bhutato Pasati. So as the whatever arises, as it arises, we must observe it closely in order to know it. So this category of Dhammas is very broad. So these various objects that arise, in the large field of observation, in the larger field of observation, the ever new arising object of observation, ever new arising object is to be observed. So within the large field of observation of our entire being, when nivaranas arise, we observe them as they are. The 5 khandhas arise, observe them as they are. The base element, the striker element, and the spark, when they arise, we note them as such, observe them as they are. The truth of suffering, as it arises, we observe it as it is, we note it as it is. The truth of its cause, samudaya satya, we observe it as it is, note it as it is. So the ever new arising object within the field of observation is to be observed, and one has to observe what is evident and what is arising every second as it is, observing closely. So observing closely, repeatedly, the arising general activity is Dhammanupassana satipatthana. So we need to observe closely, and for that we need to make effort. So the evident arising Dhammas must be observed repeatedly as Dhammas. This word anu in anupassana means to again and again. One has to observe the object repeatedly. And how we do this is with aiming and making effort. And when we make effort to observe the object, sati arises and sticks to the object. When sati is present, then samadhi will also be present. And what happens then is we come to know. So knowing, observing, knowing repeatedly the arising general activity is Dhammanupassana satipatthana. We know physicality and mentality. We know cause and effect. And we know the 3 aspects of the true phenomena. So this is observing closely, repeatedly, knowing closely, repeatedly. The arising general activity is Dhammanupassana satipatthana. So when we're meditating and sitting, observing every object that arises without a break, beginning with the rising and the falling. Let's say that laziness arises and one doesn't want to make any effort at all. One just wants to take it easy. That's laziness. In Pali, this is called tinamnida, and sloth and torpor is what we would call it in English. So we just note it when it arises, and it's a true phenomenon, it's mentality, it's a Dhamma, it is Dhamma that is just arising, and it's apparent, it's an obvious object. So how do we note it? We note it as Dhamma. No. We note it as lazy, sloth, and so on. To note it, we have to make effort as soon as it arises, and we should make the effort so that we know the object, not in order to dispel it. We should have the attitude of noting it just to know it. So we push our mind to the object with effort so that we can make the mind stick to that laziness. And we also aim so that we can be aligned with the object. Doing so, the mind falls on the object, and one knows laziness, and it disappears. Sometimes what happens is laziness arises, and one notes it, and it disappears. It arises again, one notes it, and it disappears. So In this way, one knows its characteristic, one knows the nature of laziness, and one also knows its impermanent aspect. It arises and passes away. So with whose help do we know this? We know this with the help of virya, sati, samadhi. This is sampajano. One knows by oneself clearly and distinctly. One knows correctly. And one knows by oneself not due to reading about it, but directly. So when we know, the ignorance is dispelled, just as darkness disappears when light arises. We don't have to do anything special to make darkness go away. When light arises, it goes away naturally. And the same thing, when knowledge arises, ignorance is dispelled automatically. Sorry, I can't read this. So when we know like this, then the mind is not scattered. There's no ignorance and there's no knowing in the wrong way. The mind is also not scattered, and there's no lack of moral shame or lack of moral fear regarding akusalas. And how does this occur? This knowledge occurs regarding the laziness which arises. So because of our observation of this quality of laziness, knowledge arises. And this knowledge is Vipassana knowledge. And it's also kusala citta, wholesome mind. And it's also called Panya Bhumi, the field of wisdom, or the field of Vipassana, the ground in which knowledge arises. One must work to create this. This laziness, sloth and torpor, occurs often in yogis who practice lightly, careless yogis. If we observe, we'll get a benefit, but the yogi doesn't think like that. So when laziness arises, the yogi doesn't note it. And therefore, the sloth and torpor becomes strong. And then what happens is, ignorance and lack of moral shame, lack of moral dread, scattering of mind, these also become stronger and stronger. And meeting something good, one wants good things. When we meet up with something that we don't like, become angry. And this is how one spends most of their time. The time is just used up with these kilesas. So based on one initial occurrence of laziness, many kilesas arise. Just like on a little plot of land, first one weed and then many. So that initial object of laziness that arose and wasn't noted is the ground for kilesas to arise. First of all, in the moment where it wasn't observed, it arose but was not observed. So ignorance arose, and through not noting, subsequently other weeds also arose. So first one, then many. And that's known as kilesa bhumi, the field of kilesas, or ground for kilesas. So if we observe the object so that knowledge arises, we get a profit every time we do this. And not noting, one loses this every single second. So when we note, we gain the benefit. When we note and know, the kilesas are dispelled and Vipassana knowledge arises concerning the object. So with the method of Satipatthana, when various objects arise, the Dhammas arise, one needs to note them as they arise. When we do this, when we note them and know them, that object we observe becomes Vipassana Bhumi, the field of Vipassana. When the nivaranas arise, when the hindrances arise, we have to prevent them from arising, but if they arise, we need to note them as they are. If we just let them go, if we don't bother to note them, what they'll do is just take up more and more space. So we must note them as soon as they arise. When we do this, they don't have a place. We don't give them the land on which to develop further weeds. So if they don't have any plot of land, if they don't have access to the object of observation, if we observe them, they won't have any place to develop. They won't have any land. If no land, then there will be no weeds. So to make that happen, we need to observe them, note them as soon as they arise. As soon as kilesas arise, we must note them, because then no further ones will arise. Those who don't note laziness, sloth and torpor, sleepiness when it arises, give way to many kilesas to arise. Just on that little plot of earth, there was the laziness, the initial laziness, an abundance of kilesas arise. So there's physicality, and feeling. Physicality is something to be known, feeling is something to be known. Seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, so on. Everything that we experience is an object to be observed. And if we don't know, we won't know. So there will be ignorance, and there will be ahiri, lack of moral shame, and anotapa, lack of moral dread. And the mind will be scattered, and there will be anger if we meet with something detestable, and so on. So whether it's the collection of physicality, or whether it's feelings, whether it's the mind, whether it's seeing phenomena, whether it's hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, whatever arises, if we note it with effort and sati and samadhi, the mind will fall on the object, knowledge will develop, and ignorance will be dispelled. Ahiri, lack of moral dread, moral fear lack of moral shame will be dispelled, lack of moral dread will be dispelled, and the scattering of mind, udicca, will be dispelled. And then no matter how likable the object is, there won't be any lobha, lust arising. No matter how detestable the object is, there won't be any greed. So in this way, the object of observation becomes the field of knowledge. So this is how, based on the 5 khandhas, the 5 aggregates, kilesa bhumi, the field of kilesas, and panya bhumi, the field of wisdom, come to be. Similarly, in one's being. There's seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, and so on. And these arise due to causes. These are Dhammas. Every time they arise, we need to make effort to note them as they are. We label them as they are. When samadhi arises, one will see the base, the striker, and the spark. The base element, the striker element, and the spark. And knowing, ignorance will be dispelled. And at the same time, one will be disgusted by the thought of kilesas entering. One will be disgusted and one will fear kilesas coming in. And the mind will be stable. The mind won't run away. And even if there's a likable object, there won't be any longing or craving. If there's a detestable object, there won't be any anger or hatred. So regarding the base, the striker, and the spark, knowledge arises. One knows the sabhava lakkhana, the individual characteristic, the true nature, and the common characteristics. One comes to know, and eventually one comes to know in a very active way. Vipassana knowledge arises regarding the Dhammas of the base, the striker, and spark. And this is Vipassana Bhumi, the field of Vipassana. If we don't observe, there will be Kilesa Bhumi, the field of Kilesas. So when the truth of suffering arises, if we observe it, we will know. And if we don't observe, Kilesas will arise. So knowing this, one makes effort. One makes effort to note the object with the method of satipatthana. And thus, likable objects don't cause any lobha, detestable objects do not cause any anger. And so one knows, one comes to know individual and common characteristics. So this is Vipassana Bhumi, this is the field of Vipassana. So Dhammas are simply Bhumi. All Dhammas are some type of ground. So this is how, when we observe, the field of Vipassana arises. When we don't observe, the field of Kilesas arises. The Buddha compared yogis to a gardener. And if one plants a seed in the garden, one wants to protect the plant, so one puts up a fence. And one needs to water the plant and also rake the soil, make sure that the soil is not too hard or clumpy. And one has to add fertilizer. And one also needs to prevent pests. And if any pests come to eat the plant, then one has to eliminate them by some suitable means. And one has to prevent cobwebs and things like that. All these things are disturbances to the plant. So these are the things that one must do if the seed and the plant that comes from it will be strong. The practicing yogi is like the gardener. The yogi plants the seed of Vipassana, and so that the seed won't be destroyed, one protects it with the fence of sila. And one has to water the Vipassana plant by listening to the Dhamma talk. And one also has to rake the soil so that it's not too clumpy and add fertilizer. And this is like going to the interviews and explaining about one's practice is like raking, and then when a teacher gives you advice, then that's like adding fertilizer. So when the plant sprouts, then one has to eliminate pests. And in our practice, this means that one has to always observe the arising object with aim and effort in order to have samadhi, so that the nivaranas, which are like pests, will be eliminated. And so that subtle craving doesn't arise regarding our experience, we have to note firmly when feeling arises. So if one does so, one will develop Vipassana knowledge until path and fruition. So what is it that helps the field of Vipassana to develop? It's the three parenyas, the three kinds of full understanding. And what is it that causes the field of kilesas to arise? So these are topics that will be discussed tomorrow because there's no more time today.